Welcome to Deep Transformation, Self-Society Spirit. I'm Roger Walsh, and our co-host is John Dupuy, author of the classic Integral Recovery and founder of the Integral Recovery movement. Today, we have the opportunity of looking at the synthesis of the enormous amount of information we have. The information explosion keeps exploding, and we're inundated with information and drowning in data. How to make sense of it all? That's one of the real questions of our time. Unfortunately, at the very time when we need the most, some people have stepped forward and begun to create what are called meta theories, overarching maps of human knowledge. And the greatest of these big picture thinkers is Ken Wilber, founder of what's called integral theory, a system for mapping and framing and understanding, frankly, the whole of human knowledge. How to make sense of it, how to integrate it, how to see how it relates, different parts relate to each other. And Wilber is a prodigious synthesizer and a prodigious reader. And I often say you can read 500 books, or I can read the one in which Ken Wilber synthesizes them all, and got through that. But Wilber has now himself written a couple of dozen books, and it takes quite a bit to get through those. But fortunately, we have with us today Brad Reynolds, who has devoted much of his life to studying and exploring Ken Wilber's integral theory, and has written two of his own books, which provide beautiful introductions and overviews to Ken Wilber's life work and to integral theory. Those books are first, Embracing Reality, the Integral Vision of Ken Wilber, which gives a chapter-by-chapter guide to all Ken's major writings. And the second is Where's Wilber At? Ken Wilber's Integral Vision in the New Millennium. Brad has other books, such as God's Great Tradition of Global Wisdom. But today we'll be focusing on the thought of Ken Wilber and having the opportunity of Brad guiding us through this huge body of work and thought and synthesis the Wilber's created. Brad has devoted much of his life to understanding Wilber's vast intellectual output. And I guess the obvious question is, Brad, what led you to devote so much of your life to understanding Ken Wilber's work and providing the beautiful syntheses you have?
Well, thank you, Roger and John, for inviting me onto this Deep Transformation podcast. And I'm very happy to talk about Ken because he was a major influence in my life, one of my mentors. And what led me to getting involved in Wilber's work was way back in 1982, as soon as I had graduated art college over in Oakland, the California College of Arts and Crafts. I came across his book, Up from Eden, which had a hominid on the front cover, crouched over, and it said a transpersonal view of human evolution. And immediately my ears picked up because ever since I was a child and watched Louis Leakey National Geographic shows and learned about the evolutionary development of humankind from hominids, I have been fascinated with human evolution. In fact, I actually worked for the Institute of Human Origins, run by Don Johanson, who was the man who discovered the Lucy fossils, the Australopithecus afarensis, right? And so Wilber's book immediately caught my attention, and once I bought it and started reading it, I was living in Berkeley at that time, I was astounded by how it covered so much of evolution from early archaic hominids all the way up through the development of Paleolithic shaman tribal cultures into civilizations, finally up into the modern world. And not only that, Wilber had a depth in his presentation because he included the human worldviews, the different stages of development that humanity went through, from archaic to magical to mythic to mental to integral. that showed an understanding that I couldn't get from the scientific books, right? And not only that, Wilber had a highly developed sense of an understanding of the mystical traditions. So he was presenting Buddha's place within this great evolutionary developmental arc, and how Jesus fit in there, and how all the great adepts of the world religions brought a higher form of consciousness into their historical period, and as advanced tipped individuals they helped evolve all of human race. And scientists don't talk like that. And it was just really fascinating. And as it turned out, he was also suggesting not only as the human race evolved, but also that the adepts themselves have evolved in their teachings. Their teachings have gotten more profound as the years have gone on, or better expressed. And there was this one footnote, I think on like page 320, that happened to mention he thought that the 20th century had shown some of the world's greatest adepts. And he mentioned Aurobindo, he mentioned Sri Ramana Maharshi, and he mentioned this guy, Baba Frijan, right? And I said, well, I know who Aurobindo is. I've heard of Ramana Maharshi, though I didn't know him very well. But who is Baba Frijan? Well, it turned out that Baba Frijan was Da Frijan, who is now Adi Da. And I went and found some Adi Da's books, and I was so impressed that Adi Da became my guru. And as it turned out, Ken Wilber was doing a book signing at Shambhala bookstores in Berkeley, and I wanted to go shake the hand of the man who turned me on to my guru. So Ken, as you know, is pretty reclusive, and he does not get out in the public much. So it was a very rare opportunity back in 1982, October 22nd, because he signed my book, A Sociable God, that had just been come out. And of course, he was impressed that somebody would actually walk up to him and want to thank him for turning him on to a guru, right? And we exchanged addresses at that time. In fact, Ken at that time was living with Roger Walsh. Um, and in a year or two, he had met Treya over at Rogers. And so I had a couple opportunities to drop by and take some material from Adidas organization over to Ken, because Ken was a big supporter at that time. And we just kind of got to know each other. I'd bump into him in Mill Valley every once in a while, and he would go, Brad. And I'd go, God, Ken Wilber, the world famous philosopher, remembers my name. And then I began to go to the California Institute of Integral Studies in the 1990s, and had the great privilege of working with, studying under people like Stan Groff and Richard Tarnas, and William Irving Thompson, and all these wonderful professors. And so I started writing papers, and I noticed that a lot of them were very critical of Ken's work, which surprised me because Ken was world renowned at that time. They all loved him, but they were also critical. So I wrote a few papers defending Ken's work, and then I sent my papers to Ken. And amazingly, he was so impressed, he asked me to come and work with him and write some books explaining his more complicated theories to the general public. That was his intention. And this was around 1995 when Sex Ecology Spirituality came out, which we would call his phase 4 works, his Aquil presentations. And so from about 1995 to 2004, I got to work directly with Ken. And I got to ask him any question I wanted. We basically almost communicated with each other daily, usually through written. Those were back in the days of fax machines, before emails even started. And so that's how our relationship developed, and that's how my 2 books developed. This one, Embracing Reality, was a result of him asking me to go through each one of his books and summarize the chapters in a few paragraphs, which I found to be an extremely daunting task. But fortunately, I had been buying and reading Ken's books as the years had gone on since 1982. So I was basically up to speed. And, what a privilege that was for some Hoosier from Indiana, living out in California, to be able to work with, as Roger recognized, one of the world's great philosophical geniuses. In fact, one of the quotes I liked about Ken, he says, "Perhaps the simplest way to explain my work is to say that it's a synthesis of the world's great religions, and then throw in the world's great philosophies and psychologies to boot."
There you have it.
Which
That
is
covers
pretty
it.
much it, right?
Yeah. So let's step back. You've had the privilege of working closely with Ken, and you've also given a very detailed study of his work, as detailed as anyone I know. And you've gone further than that and provided overviews and syntheses and introductions. So where would you, as you step back, how would you characterize, what do you think Ken's place in history is?
Well, that's a interesting question. I think personally, 100 years from now, 200 years from now, he will be one of the few people that people will still be reading. I think he's going to have a profound impact, just like Hegel did, but even more so, because one of the beauties of Ken's work that transcends postmodern philosophers and other philosophers of different systems in today's modern culture is that Ken is always encouraging people to take up mystical practice, and taking up spiritual practice and understanding the higher transpersonal dimensions of reality is always going to be something that humanity is going to want every generation. And, artificial intelligence is never going to be able to take that away from us, because those type of understandings and realities exist deep within our own heart. And all humankind has, throughout all the millennia, has always wanted that. So Ken's always going to have an appeal, let alone the fact, as you both know, John and Roger, that Ken's writing, the way he can write and explain the most complex and difficult topics so simply and so articulately is, beyond compare to anybody else I know within our generation. And that was part of the attraction that people had to him. He's so incredibly deft at being able to explain things that are so hard. And I think people will always need that type of explanation moving forward throughout history.
And and to preview, we'll want to go through in more detail some of his works and books, as you've done in your book Embracing Reality. But first, maybe you could. This is a very difficult question because Ken has probably come up with more new ideas, more important new ideas than anyone I know. But what do you think of as his main contributions?
Well, I would tend to put an emphasis on the evolution and the development of consciousness through a spectrum model.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, right on.
Yeah.
Brad, I was going to ask you. I tried to ask you before, but I was muted, so I was going, God, these guys, they won't let me say anything. And but was there any? This is like even going back further than when you first met Ken, and that led to your development. Had you had first person experiences, spiritual, mystical, peak, non-dual, that prepared you? So when you did meet Ken, things started clicking. Was there stuff that preceded it?
Yes, that's absolutely true, John. I was a child during the 60s, so I was a young adult in the 70s. And of course, as most of my friends and people in my generation, I experimented with the drugs, but I didn't just use the psychedelics as a party tool, which almost everybody I knew did. I actually used them as an entheogen, as a way of trying to understand what was going on, because it was pretty obvious to me that the scientific consumer culture I'd been born into did not provide the answers that I needed. Even though I did spend some time trying to explore Jesus Christ, I wasn't satisfied. And so I turned my attention to the East, So since the mid 70s, I had been studying Taoism. In fact, I was surprised when I read that Ken was first inspired by Lao Tzu as well, as was I. And as you might know, Lao Tzu's famous Tao Te Ching, the first chapter, starts it all off where he says the Tao that can be spoken is not the eternal Tao. The name that can be named is not the eternal name. The nameless is the beginning of heaven and earth. The named is the mother of the 10,000 things. Therefore, rid yourself of desires in order to observe its secrets, but allow yourself to have desires in order to observe its manifestations. These two are the same, yet differ as they issue forth. Being the same, they are called mysteries. Mysteries upon mysteries. That is the gateway to the manifold secrets of spirituality. And so that inspired Ken, and that also inspired me. I wanted to enter that gate and find out about those manifold secrets of spirituality. And of course, one of the things I found out, just like the Beatles did, is that drugs aren't the answer. So I turned to meditation. And Ken was a very well-developed meditator. So by the time I came across Ken, I had already had a deep experience of the divine reality that we all inhere in. And so his words really resonated with me. I felt I was reading somebody that had actually lived and experienced the same truths that I had experienced. So when he looked through the view of the prism of history, I resonated with what he was seeing, that the higher states of consciousness that he was bringing forward, mostly he used the tools of Buddhism to express those deeper truths. But I saw them as universal truths, as Ken does too. A lot of times people can accuse Ken of being Buddhist, right? But he's really universal. In fact, it was the perennial philosophy that he introduced me to that was the foundation upon a lot of the statements he was making about the higher transpersonal realms. And it was like, wow, I just discovered, Fort Knox. It was a gold mine of wisdom. And just like Roger said, it was like, wow, I don't have to read all these other books now. I can just start reading Ken Wilber books, right? But I was an artist. What did I know, right? I was working, I got a job painting barracks for the Navy, right? But then during lunch break, I'd go out to my car and I'd be reading A Sociable God. And I never had any inclination that I would end up being able to actually work with Ken Wilber, 10, 15 years later. So it was a slow process of development for myself as well.
But
So
you
thank
did
you for
come
that
to
question.
Yeah, but you did come to work with him, and you came to synthesize his his work as no one else has. Well, people have tried, but I think yours is the most comprehensive and most detailed. Um, let's see. We'll want to get into the kind of development of Ken's thought, but one more question about the big overview on Ken Wilber's thinking. And that is, what do you see as the major themes that run through his work? You've mentioned a couple, like the emphasis on evolution. John mentioned it. You both mentioned evolution of consciousness, and you've pointed to a couple of others. But what do you see as the main themes that get emphasized through Ken's work?
Well, another good question that could probably take a half hour to go through, but I don't know, just off the top of my head, I think the pre-trans fallacy was a very important discovery in which he explained how the pre-personal structures of consciousness, which involved magical and mythical civilizations, preceded the rise of modern science. But then the transpersonal or mystical states of consciousness were really only experienced by a small population in historical times. The masses themselves were living under the sway of magical and mythical thinking, which you can see our great religions still reflect a lot of that. Whereas the mystical trend was a higher development, and Ken helped clarify that. So what it became was an excellent way of critiquing scientific materialism, right? Ken offered a critique of modernity and now even post-modernity that other philosophers weren't able to really grapple with because they hadn't done the necessary work of cultivating the higher transpersonal states, which does take a lot of work. You got to spend a lot of time meditating and studying a tradition or studying under certain masters, which Ken did. Ken had Zen masters from before he wrote his first book, because he was exploring these great things. So being able to critique the disasters of modernity, yet at the same time, Ken really found a way to have mysticism include the rational, right? Transcend and include was another one of his major themes that had not really been effectively understood before. So the mythic included the magical shamanic cultures, but it transcended it. It offers something more. And then the mental structure transcended and included both the magical, archaic, and mythic structures. And mysticism, or integral thinking, transcends and includes all that. Ken didn't want to dispense with science. He wanted to include it, even if he transcended its weaknesses. And for our modern culture that is caught in this great cultural war between religion and science, it seemed to be an ideal solution where you can include both the positive aspects of religion and the positive aspects of science, and yet jettison their disasters and their failings, and actually then create a greater, higher, expanded consciousness that has, the tools of both of those. So, that's a very important reality. And I think that's part of the reason so many people have been attracted to Ken's work.
So a major feature of his work is his capacity to not do either or thinking, but both and to look at and to draw distinctions to see, well, people are so often when we're examining something like religion, that's a vast topic, but even what religion means, I mean, Ken came up with about 12 different meanings of religion, and so many times you see in Ken Wilber's work these confusions and conflicts that seem to go on forever, and yet Ken will look very carefully at exactly what different people mean by different things. And once you have those distinctions, then a lot of the conflicts kind of dissolve.
That's right. And that's the beauty of using the spectrum model, where you have these different levels of growth and different wavelengths. I mean, that's when he debuted his first book called The Spectrum of Consciousness back in 1977. That's what attracted us all. He was saying that, hey, all the different psychologies, because you had Freudian, Jungian, transactional, all the different psychologies, he didn't say one is right and the others are wrong. He says each of them are addressing a different level on the spectrum. And just like all the different religions, it's not one of them's right or one of them's wrong. Each of them are addressing a different developmental awareness. So Ken then was able to look at religion and go, well, yeah, there's a bunch of different definitions of religion, but it kind of depends if you're talking about magical religion or mythic religion or, even a rational religion, right? Or are you talking about a shamanic religion or a mystical religion? So that alone, expands your capacity to being able to understand things that are usually put in an and or situation. So as you were saying,
and we will interpret these mystical experience according to where we're at on the scale. So if you're at a very traditional level, it's gonna be very different from somebody who's postmodern. Although it could be phenomenologically could be almost the exact same experience, but we will interpret them according to where we're at in our journey. And sometimes, of course,
right.
It can be a great leap forward. When you have one of these
That's right.
experiences, kicks you into the next level. Not beyond the next level, but into and maybe a taste of higher up, but you have to go back and do the work where you find yourself right now.
Yes, that's absolutely right. That's an important part of the integral theory. But I'm glad you mentioned the fact that I think the stage that we're at, our center of gravity, as in Ken's terms, influences the way we interpret things. But it isn't the sole determinant, because as you were mentioning, John, there's also an attractor aspect of it. If you have a higher peak experience, a lot of times it awakens you to a new possibilities, and you actually realize, wow, that actually felt more real than the old views that I had. And so it starts to send you in this process of deep transformation.
Felt more real than reality.
That's right. Yeah, expanding your view on reality, because obviously reality is always already the case, and reality encompasses all perspectives.
And you've already launched us into Ken's first book, Brad, the Spectrum of Consciousness. And just to recapitulate, you're pointing out that in this first book, he was able to provide a spectrum, as he saw it, spectrum of stages or levels of consciousness, and to map different psychologies and contemplative practices and traditions on that, and to see that, there's been all this internecine warfare, say, within psychology between Freudianism and Jungians and et cetera, et cetera. I've lived in that world. But here was someone who, for the first time, was able to say, no, each of these addresses a different stage or state on the spectrum of consciousness. And as such, each makes a valid but partial contribution to our understanding of the psyche and of humankind and of the cosmos. Was it beautiful?
Absolutely right. And that's why his reputation immediately skyrocketed, right? He had people like Houston Smith saying things, the great world religion scholar, saying things like, Ken Wilber must be a genius. He's been working, he is addressing topics I have been working on for 30 years and has clarified them for me, I
always thought I saw Spectrum of Consciousness like, oh, this was the book I hoped to write when I was about 70.
Yeah, right, exactly. When I started reading Ken, I said, man, this guy's shot my work forward 20 years.
Yeah. So that was Ken's first major contribution, was the idea of this spectrum of consciousness and the possibility of seeing that different psychologies and contemplative traditions address different levels of this spectrum. So take us now on to, and so that's sometimes called Ken's phase one work, his spectrum view of
right.
Everything. But then there was a shift, and in what came to be known as phase two, where it was he introduced development. So take us through that, please.
Yeah, that's a very important phase shift for Ken. So phase one is, basically 1973 to 1978. He wrote The Spectrum in 73, though it didn't get published until 77. And he actually caused the shift to phase two, the evolution revolution, his most dramatic change in his worldview, because he started writing the Atman project, and something wasn't working for him. He realized that the spectrum view he had presented wasn't involving the developmental thrust of consciousness development in the way that he felt was necessary. So he went through a real intense intellectual crisis, which he writes about wonderfully in an essay he wrote called Odyssey, My Personal Exploration or whatever. And he goes through the different, discord he was feeling. And he said his whole body was aching because he couldn't figure out what was wrong. And so he put Atman Project aside and he started working on Up for Meeden because he wanted to examine the historical evidence. And then on a Zen meditation retreat in the spring of 1978, when his Roshi said to him, the ego is the last boundary to the divine. I didn't quite get that right,
It's
but
a last stronghold of the ego.
yeah, or the witness is, and
Witness is the last stronghold of
is
the
the
ego.
stronghold of the ego. That's it. And Ken all of a sudden had a satori in which he experienced the divine truth beyond the self condition. And of course, the way he writes about it is unbelievable. So he had an awakening like the Buddha did. And that allowed him to see that the entire spectrum itself is grounded in the divine consciousness, right? And so the idea that spirit is not only the goal of development, it's also the ground in which all the stages exist, gave him a key to unlocking the developmental evolution of the spectrum of consciousness. And of course, that is now the main thrust of his work, which of course now has been modified with the 4 quadrants. You know, the 4 quadrants happen on every level as you progress up. But that's what then, so he was able to finish Atman Project, and then he finished Up for Meeden. And both of those books outline the developmental thrust of Ken Wilber's entire career. So that's what allowed him to uncover the pre-trans fallacy, to look at the development from pre-personal to personal to transpersonal, or from pre-egoic to egoic to trans-egoic, pre-rational to rational to trans-rational. And it was like he just burst forth in creativity because the man was putting out a book. Then he started putting out a book about every year, you know. So he put out Atman Project, Up for Meeden, Eye to Eye, where he talks about, he introduces the 3 eyes of knowing, knowing with the eye of the flesh or the physical senses or their extensions, like using microscopes, telescopes, the eye of the mind or the eye of reason, which is using theories then to use the data that you get with the eye of the senses, which is what science does, but then the eye of the spirit, which is using transpersonal meditative techniques and contemplation in order to open up new dimensions that go beyond the eye of the flesh and the eye of the mind, right? And then there was a sociable God, where he applied this developmental theory to society and a sociology, because the understanding of consciousness development affects the way the society works and the institutions run is an important aspect of what a true philosopher will provide. And Ken was able to do that. And then he was able to offer a critique on quantum questions, right?
Well, Brad, let's go back to the development here, because you made the very important point that, you know, this was the breakthrough that Ken had, and which allowed him to move into this new phase of his work and to look at everything from human psychology to evolution to religions in developmental terms. But maybe we can give a little more detail on exactly what he laid out in his, or discovered in his development, because this was really the first time someone had given what he called a full spectrum view of development, tracing psychological development from infancy all the way through adolescence, normal adulthood, late adult stages, and then into transpersonal stages. So maybe tell us something about that, because that's an enormous contribution. I hate us to gloss over it.
Yes, it really is. So one of the ways that he addressed the different stages of development is he called them fulcrums. because you would go through a turning point of developing a new and higher worldview of transcend and include. So he used the work of the developmental psychologists, particularly Jean Piaget, in tracing the development from, sensory motor to pre-operational thought to concrete operational to formal reflexive operational, which basically is the development from an infant through childhood into adolescence to by the time you're 21 years old, you're an adult and you should have a well-functioning formal reflexive intelligence, which is what schooling does. Our schooling systems nowadays tend to teach people how to be rational, critical thinkers, right? And
Ideally.
yeah, ideally. Yeah, of course, there's always the traumas and everything that interfere with us, and which is why psychology is so important in helping us clean up our shadows and our wounds and the different things that we need to do to be a healthy, functioning ego in the world. But as any adult knows, over time, even if you are handling all your responsibilities with your family and your job and everything else, if you haven't developed a deep spiritual life, a transpersonal life, you're going to feel you're missing something. And so you go from the sensory physical to the emotional sexual, through the rep mind, to the role mind, to the mental reflexive. And then the next big stage is what psychology was calling humanistic psychology or existential psychology. And this is where Abraham Maslow and Erich Fromm and all the great psychologists of the late 50s and 60s started exploring that, wow, not only do you have to satisfy your basic needs, but once all those basic needs are satisfied, the desire for self-actualization becomes a drive. And so Ken was able to articulate all that. But then Ken did something nobody else had really done, is he subdivided the transpersonal stages into the psychic, the subtle, the causal, and the non-dual. And that's what Atman Project and Up for Meeting so expertly showed, is how even mystical states have a developmental arc until finally perfect enlightenment where the self is fully transcended and you see that you are part of all of the entire universe. You are the entire universe. Your identity is ultimately the identity with God itself, or Brahman. And that's exactly what the most sacred scriptures of the world all talk about, from the Upanishads up through all the teachings of Buddhism, and et cetera, et cetera. And so Ken's spectrum was able to follow that developmental arc in a way that nobody else did. And then not only that, he recognized that you can have a neurosis or a error happening in each of those developmental stages. And so he understood how the psychopathologies of psychosis and narcissistic borderline misdevelopments could be addressed with, structural uncovering techniques and psychoanalysis and script analysis, and identity neurosis could be addressed with introspection and this type of thing. And then not only that, he suggested that psychic disorders could be addressed by the path of the yogis, what he called the path of the yogis, or that subtle illusions, what he called the Vishnu complex, right, could be addressed by further meditative practices. And so he gave an entire range. That's what Transformations of Consciousness, which came out in 1986, was kind of the epitome book capsulizing the phase 2 developmental process that he actually did with Daniel Brown and Bruce Eckert, was it? Do you know, Roger, right offhand?
I think it was
It's right behind you.
Yes, it is. Brown and Engler. Jack Engler.
And that's where he suggested that, not only do all these different developmental levels provide a worldview, they also have a way of healing the misdevelopments that occur through that process. And
Brad, can I just stop you here for a moment, because you have
sure.
downloaded so much, but I want to make sure we don't lose this, because there's a lot in what you said, and and the problem with Wilber is, you just outlined some of the main things of the book, but like there are you just listed about half a dozen different ideas, any one of which would have been a major breakthrough. So, so, so let's just step back and say that in his phase two, the first book, the Atman Project, which was on human development, he basically laid out the first full spectrum model of development. That is, looking at the stages of development from infancy through adulthood, which Western psychology had mapped out, then continuing in post-conventional transpersonal stages, all the way to Atman, Brahman, various stages of awakening. Now, he'd refine that later, but that in itself is an amazing accomplishment. So let's just acknowledge that. But then, as you
and he made it look so easy too.
Well, well, maybe sometimes. But in addition to that, he pointed out that and there here we're getting a little into, as you pointed out, his later book in 1986, Transformations of Consciousness, pointed out that at each stage, development can go wrong in some way. That there's a stage, there are stage-specific pathologies at every stage from infancy through awakening. Now, that in itself is an enormous contribution. But then he pointed out the specific kinds of therapies that are maybe most skillful and appropriate for each of those stage-specific pathologies. And, we've had decades of psychology and therapies fighting with one another, saying, the only true way is. But no, Ken provided an answer. Well, it's maybe, the most skillful therapy for this stage pathology is, Freudian analysis, but at the later stage, existentialism, or a contemplative stage, more, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So here a major mapping of development of potential pathologies and appropriate therapies. I mean, that's an extraordinary contribution.
Absolutely. It was groundbreaking, right? I mean, you were there and you realized, and in a certain sense, it went beyond transpersonal psychology. A lot of his papers were published in the Journal of Transpersonal Psychology. But as Ken started to recognize, transpersonal psychology, he felt, was too focused on altered states of consciousness. And so that's when it was during the early 80s is when he started talking about integral psychology. He wanted to go off on his own and create a psychology that was able to do exactly what you so well described, Roger, was give a method and a model and a map that would show how each of the different treatment modalities could address the different levels of psychopathology. So then Freudian and Jungian analysis don't have to be in conflict, but they can actually work together in harmony. And
Beautiful.
that
Yes.
is why so many professionals in the field were attracted to Ken Wilber's work.
And when his integral model began to emerge later on, the aqua map, all quadrants, all levels, all lines, all types, and all states, not only did all the stuff that you've mentioned before, all these paradigm rattling, earth-shaking ideas that came through him, he also showed us how it all fits together. All these pieces come together in one map. And in addition, I think this is extremely important. He emphasized the importance of practice,
right,
of spiritual, physical, emotional practice. He identified the essential lines or parts of ourselves that we needed to work on to put this map together. So it wasn't just a great intellectual, cheeseburger. It was like something that we could participate in. And the map became our guide for walking through this journey of evolution, both collective and individual.
Very
Beautifully
well
said.
put.
Yeah, nice.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. As he said, mysticism is doing, not reading. And another one of my favorite quotes is how's it go? A book on mysticism. No, the purpose of a book on mysticism should be to persuade the reader to take up mystical practices. And of course, as his later developments, so that's what phase 3 really evolved into in the later 80s, is when he was recognizing how it wasn't just a solid big lump stage by stage clunking up, is that there were different developmental lines and streams. And this is something he recognized in the early 80s. He mentions it, but his work didn't really focus on that because it was more focused on the stage development. And of course, his work got sidetracked in the late 80s when he fell in love with Treya, and she was diagnosed with cancer 10 days after their marriage. And 5 years later, she would pass away. So he basically took a 10-year hiatus between 86 and 95, where he did not publish any new books. And she passed away in 1990, maybe 91. And then he basically went on a 3-year writing retreat and developed the Aquil model, where he discovered the 4 quadrants that then was presented in 1995 with Sex, Ecology, Spirituality. And then once again, he started publishing a book every year into the new millennium, and to further refine that developmental scheme you were talking about. States. He also brought forward the importance of states as opposed to just stages, and peak experiences, and how they were attractors to help you then make the journey through the developmental stages of life. And also the different lines, how an emotional line could be less developed than your cognitive line, and that could be less developed, or your spiritual line's even less developed than all of those. And how to be integral is to integrate all those different aspects of the human personality and the self. And of course, the difficulty of it is by the time you're entering the transpersonal levels, you're actually having to begin to transcend the self, or what he called the self system, or rather our identity with those different worldviews and levels of development. In fact, his second book, No Boundary, is still a very powerful book. In fact, my understanding is therapists actually like that book the best, because he kind of Ken explains, even before the evolutionary model became so important, is how important it is to learn to identify with no boundary awareness, because our self-identity tends to be bound by whatever level or self-concept that we have of ourselves. And of course, the whole purpose of true spiritual practice is to loosen our identity with ourself. And by doing that, paradoxically, you actually open up to identify with the world as a whole, and to thus then become more compassionate and loving. And so actually the heart is what takes over. And as the mind realizes that there are limits to its capacity to understand the universe, ultimately the heart must become the driving force to make a person a whole human being, right?
And
Brad, again. Okay, I'll jump in. Brad, again, you've given us so much, and part of that has included a number of terms with which some people may not be familiar. So let me just kind of point to some of the many important things you've said, because again, the trouble with Ken is, you mention a new idea and it's like, well, this could be worth an hour-long discussion. But let's just emphasize some of the things you've said. First, pointed out that Ken drew a distinction between states of consciousness and stages of development. And you went past that pretty quickly, but that in itself is an extremely important distinction. And when we get to his later work on religion, implications, some of the implications of those will become apparent. But yes, there had been in the 60s and 70s this big emphasis on altered states of consciousness, meditation, psychedelics, contemplative practices, et cetera, et cetera. But Ken was very instrumental in popularizing the importance of stages of development and pointing out these are two very different things. So first that, but then you mentioned, and you just did in one sentence, that in his phase 3, he not only laid out stages of development, but stages for different developmental lines. But many people may not know what lines are. So lines are basically a term for different capacities of the psyche, for emotions or cognition or faith or whatever. And you implied, Brad, but I want to just emphasize that those different capacities can mature. They all go through their own individual stages, corresponding stages, but they can mature at different paces or degrees. So there can be these imbalances between, for example, high cognitive development and low moral development. Then you get something like a psychopath or a sociopath. So there's enormous amount in what you said then. But then you introduced the idea and you just gave the term of quadrants, but people may, as a further refinement of Ken's work, once he'd laid out, first off, a spectrum of consciousness, second, development, and the idea that humans develop through multiple stages from pre-personal, personal, transpersonal, but then pointing out that development occurs in somewhat different ways, reach psychological capacity. Then he stepped back and did something, just moved to a whole nother level of embrace, shall we say, using the title of your book, Embracing Reality, introducing the quadrants. So tell us something about the quadrants and what exactly they are.
Well, that is a real interesting story in his cognitive breakthroughs, because one of the things that we haven't mentioned, which was a major theme through Ken's work, was the great chain of being, which he ended up calling the great nest of spirit. And that basically recognizes that evolution proceeds by, well, we've mentioned transcend and include, but that you go basically from matter to nature, to body, to mind, to soul, and to spirit. And so, in other words, it's built upon a hierarchy. So Ken was always kind of promoting the idea of hierarchy, which during the 70s and 80s was kind of a dirty word. But Ken Wilber's work helped make people realize, well, there are natural hierarchies. Hierarchies aren't just dominant hierarchies such as in society. So during his 3-year writing retreat in the early 90s, he had written down all these different hierarchies on his yellow pads and had spread them out all over the floor. And he was trying to figure out why these different hierarchies don't seem to match up. And what he noticed is that, oh, some of these hierarchies are addressing the inner consciousness of the individual. And some of these hierarchies are addressing the worldviews of the collective society. And other hierarchies, like in science, when you go from atoms to molecules to cells, are addressing the exterior hierarchical expression. And then other hierarchies, such as going from tribes to civilizations to modern industrial world technologies, are addressing collective exteriors. And so we realized, hey, what you have is basically an interior developmental scheme, you have an exterior developmental scheme, and you have an individual developmental scheme, and you have a collective developmental scheme. So there's the 4 quadrants right there. Interior for individuals, exteriors for individuals, interiors for collective, and exteriors for collective. And so he ended up putting the interiors of individuals up in what we call the upper left, and then the upper right is the development of individual exteriors, and the same for below in the lower quadrants. And so that was an incredible breakthrough. And then that kind of became the backbone of what he presented in sex ecology, spirituality. And of course, at that time, he wasn't calling it aqua, all quadrants, all levels. That came, within the next year or so. And that also became the backbone of what A Brief History of Everything that came out in 1996 was about as well. And then he just kept further refining that. And to the point now that there's not only 4 quadrants, there are 8 zones, 2 zones within each quadrant. Because in each quadrant, you can look at something from the outside or from the inside, right? And one of the great things about the 4 quadrants was that was another way that Ken was trying to rescue the interior from scientific materialism that always reduces everything down to physical elements alone, right? And Ken was trying to point out, as many people do, that the interior elements of reality are just as authentic as the exteriors, that consciousness isn't just brain matter. It has its own realm and possibilities. And so the 4 quadrants was a way of trying to rescue the spectrum from what Ken called flatland, which was actually, part 2 of Sex Ecology Spirituality was going to be its original book called Flatland. So once again, he gave us another great method and tool for critiquing the reductionism of scientific materialism.
And flatland is what? Sorry, go ahead, John.
No, I was going to say that the flatland is when you leave out the interiors.
That's right.
It's just flat. And then he says when you actually get the other, it's like a cube instead of a square. It just opens up whole other dimensions to look at. And a couple of light years ago, you mentioned something that I wanted to comment about. You talked about how, he guides us into these transcendent states way beyond the ego. But one of the amazing things in the model too is the fact you transcend and include. You get down to it, your little ego self, well, that's God too. It just has to be in a right relationship with the larger self, but it's not like it goes away. Actually, it gets refined and becomes more precious as we continue the journey. So I think that is, I don't know, I just think that's incredibly inspiring and heartwarming.
Absolutely. Yeah, it absolutely is. And that's why now he puts a lot of emphasis on growing up and cleaning up and showing up, is because that little self, the ego self, has to be healthy and integrated. In fact, one of the fundamentals of real spiritual life is you have to have a halfway strong and developed strong ego, excuse me, in order to actually take up spiritual practices. Because otherwise you're doing spiritual bypassing, what's called spiritual bypassing. And in fact, I think it was Jack Engler, who was, by the way, the other author of that book, Transformations of Consciousness, who came up with the phrase, you have to be somebody before you can be nobody. Because the Buddhists talk about, there being no self. So you actually have to have a well-developed and balanced ego before you can actually reap the rewards of advanced meditative practices, which is part of the reason why all of the great traditions and the yogas and Buddhism and Hinduism all talk about is you have to take up ethical principles of practice and live right life. So you have to be involved in not killing, not stealing, not doing evil. as well as practicing good dietary habits and, moral ethics towards everybody. Because anybody knows if you ever sit down to meditate and you're having a bad day, or, you were yelling at people, you can't sit still. Your mind is going crazy. And so you have to have a decent, stable life in order to then have a foundation in order to explore these higher realms with equanimity and a state of serenity. And so Ken's model allows all of those issues to be addressed. Not only is there a developmental arc and he inspires all of us to evolve our consciousness, he also inspires us to fill out all the lower levels that have pathological elements to them, our shadows and that type of thing. And that is what further got refined during the phase 4 development that most people are very familiar with.
And beautifully, you're pointing to again, one of the features of Ken's work, the inclusiveness, that there is this very rare among contemporary intellectuals, a solid grounding in conventional disciplines, and disciplines, both intellectual disciplines and somatic, psychological, etc. disciplines, as well as an openness to and mastery of spiritual knowledge and familiarity with practices, but an emphasis on the importance of honoring all of them and practicing all of them, at least to whatever degrees we can, in order to be a full human being. Well, that's so
why
rare.
it's called integral.
Oh, there's a new idea. I want to make sure we don't overlook one of Ken's books, which doesn't get kind of the press that some of the others do, but you've emphasized on several occasions, Brad, and you've pointed out too, John, that the emphasis on practice in Ken's work. And so there's one of his books is Spiritual Choices, co-authored with, let's see, Dick Anthony and Bruce Ecker, I think, on the very important question of how do you discern which spiritual communities are both, let's say, safe on the one hand, as opposed to problematic and potentially dangerous on the other, and which are effective at truly inducing transformation, which he calls authenticity, as opposed to simply supporting us at our current developmental stage. And I think I'll just give a context for this book, Brad, before you explicate it for us, and to say I think this was published when in the 80s, and it was shortly after some of the catastrophes, spiritual catastrophes such as Jonestown. So there was a real concern about the possibility of spiritual pathology and the potential dangers. And the word cult suddenly ricocheted into our culture. And, there was this question, well, if you're doing anything spiritual, you're likely to be accused of being in a cult. So there was this very important year-long project that was put on by Dick Anthony, a group of people, to investigate spiritual traditions and to specifically some of the cults. And I was a partial part of this, so got to sit in on some of the interviews with people from various traditions. But it seemed like a very important work, and Ken, in his usual comprehensive way, provided some systematic understanding of how we might differentiate helpful, healing traditions and communities from problematic, even potentially dangerous ones. So, Brad, I've given a lengthy introduction or context. Please, love to have you speak to this.
Well, it's really important that you bring that up because that is a overlooked book of his. Part of the reason might be because he only contributed a chapter or two, but Dick Anthony and Bruce Eckert realized that Ken had given a paradigm, a model that they could use to what they would call adjudicate authentic spiritual teachers from cultic-oriented spiritual teachers. And so one of the easiest ways to do that is Is the charismatic leader addressing pre-personal concerns, like you must believe this in order to do that? Or are they addressing transpersonal concerns in which you actually transform your consciousness to a greater awareness? And of course, the problem came up, which you allude to, Roger, is that some of the traditions of Hinduism and Buddhism that had come over from the East, even though these were practicing yogis and Rinpoche teachers, they got caught in sexual exploits and different behavior patterns that didn't seem very spiritual at all. And of course, when they came into the modern West, who had a highly developed sense of autonomy, people weren't going to put up with what appeared to be pre-personal behavior patterns. And so Ken's book was able to, and Dick Anthony's was able to address this very important matter. And in fact, I've recently gone back and have done a study on that because I do have a spiritual teacher. So it's very important to me that people not throw out the baby with the bathwater, so to speak. Spiritual teachers do need to show a certain level of authenticity in order to be followed or to follow their teachings and stuff. And yet at the same time, so one of the ways that Ken did this is he differentiated between legitimacy, which legitimacy for him was that as a teacher at a certain level of consciousness, if he is expressing that level well, he has legitimacy. So a priest, for example, can be a very legitimate teacher of, a mythic religious tradition, right? However, that is just at a horizontal level of translation. Ken's model shows a vertical transformation of development. And so he would call, if a teacher is encouraging you to transform from mythic belief systems to actual transpersonal awareness, that gives a teacher an authenticity. And so one of Ken's chapters was titled something like Legitimacy, Authenticity, and Authority, because you want to have your authority figures be authentic. And, we all have professors and teachers, for example, that address a particular level in which they are experts at. So a physicist professor is able to translate the information of subatomic particles and molecules and that type of thing. And so we go to them for their authority on that translated level. However, you don't want to look to your physics teacher to teach you how to be a spiritual person, for example, right? Just like you don't want to look to your guru how to understand particle physics. And so the spectrum once again gave a map for people being able to discriminate and distinguish between the authority levels of certain teachers. And at the same time, you want to make sure that you're not just dumbing down to pre-personal cultic tendencies, which is obviously what Jim Jones in Jonestown were about, or Charles Manson and David Koresh, because they were very strict, you must believe this particular way. Whereas a guru is, if they are authentic, is encouraging you to develop your own capacity to become your own authority on these matters, not just to follow anybody blindly. And so that's why Spiritual Choices, which was the title of that book, is really based upon our capacity to make wise choices about what we get involved in. And yet at the same time, the great tradition of global wisdom, which is what one of my more recent books is about, wants to acknowledge the authenticity of real spiritual teachers because they have inspired humankind for centuries. All of the great spiritual teachers, both East and West, were authentic individuals. None of them are perfect per se, but they all have inspiring messages, and the authentic ones want you to develop your own consciousness so you can make the proper and wisest and most compassionate choices for your own development and for your family and for all the people that you come in contact with. So once again, Ken was on the leading edge, and I think it's a book that people should certainly avail themselves to. In fact, I don't even think it was included in his collected works, to tell you the truth.
I don't think I've read it, actually. I'm really glad you brought that up.
Yeah, it's hidden. I mean, most of the chapters are by Dick Anthony, but Dick Anthony was, a very well-known psychologist at the time who often would testify in court rulings on, cultic tendencies and, people that were suing other people and that type of thing. And yet,
I very much appreciate the way both Ken in this book and you and just what you've said about the role of gurus are once again giving us an inclusive, integrative, or to coin a phrase, integral perspective here, in which it's a both and an inclusive, and so much of the response to that initial furor and hysteria about culture was do away with all gurus. A very simplistic idea, or other exclusive responses. But Ken in his work, Dick Anthony and Ken in the book Spiritual Choices, and you in what you've just outlined about the nature of an authentic guru, have given us a very inclusive approach of, yes, be careful, and here are some of the qualities of authenticity in teachers. And I want to
let me just follow up on that, because that's very important what you just said there, Roger. And see, once again, we can see the timeless quality of what Ken's work offers humanity, because these kind of subject matters will never go out of date. I mean, even though the book came out in the late 80s, which is what, 30 years ago, it's going to be just as relevant 100 years from now, because these matters of personal development and expanded consciousness are innate to the psyche and the anatomy of human beings. And so the work that Ken Wilber has laid a foundation for could very well become as important as Plato and Aristotle. In other words, 1,000 years from now, people could still be talking about Ken Wilber. It has that kind of veracity and authenticity to it, because not only that, as he often talks about, his work isn't just about now, it points to our own future evolution. In fact, that's what your podcast is about, deep transformation. We're talking about the future evolution of the human race to develop its own higher potentials that are already innate in us. And that is a great adventure that we all have to get involved with globally, because we can still see how our world is suffering from inhumanity to man, and how these have been the same problems that create war and confusion and destruction and death and violence that have been going on for centuries. Yet it does not have to stay like that. We can transform our consciousness and develop our higher potentials, but we have to do that all together. And not only us as the masses, as the people, but our leaders also need to participate in this great evolutionary journey together.
Beautifully said, Brad. And you reminded me of a quote from Ken from Up from Eden, where he said, and I think the exact words were, "True transcendence is the only cure for the homicidal animal." And Yeah, it's like we're in a race between consciousness and catastrophe. And the idea that external, more technology, better technology, whatever, will get us out of the mess that we ourselves have created is clearly not so.
And the only way out is up. It's just kind of a simple way of saying what you
Hayden.
said. Yeah.
That's nice, John. I like that. The only way out is up. That's good. I think you've coined something for us to remember there, John. Um,
Well, I like I love your statement, Roger. The choice between consciousness or catastrophe.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, that's too true. You've given us a beautiful way of distinguishing between problematic and authentic teachers, spiritual teachers and gurus and teachers of all kinds, namely the stage-specific appropriateness of their authority. Their authority is appropriate for specific stages and specific domains of knowledge. And they encourage our own autonomy rather than binding us to them. So that's crucial. There's another area of crucial distinction that I'd like you to speak to, which is and something which the book Spiritual Choices did beautifully, was lay out the characteristics of problematic, not just teachers, but groups and communities. And how some of the distinctions between the problematic and pathological on the one hand, and the potentially transpersonal and spiritual and growth oriented on the others. Could you say a little more about that?
Well, not kind of prepared to say too much about that because I kind of went over it in talking about being able to distinguish between authentic and legitimate. The other great distinction to point out is the pre-personal. The cultism itself tends to be a pre-personal development. So you could actually call it a kind of a childish way of thinking, because in a cult, you're actually looking for the leader to kind of play your parent and to tell you how to think and what to do and all that kind of thing. And so you're submerging your autonomy. And so a lot of times people that haven't developed a strong autonomy or a strong ego sense are the ones that get attracted to cultic behavior. And unfortunately, we can also group a lot of our great world religions into that type of tendency, where people just believe the mythic structures of a particular religion and not explore its transpersonal, self-transcending structures. And I think that is very true with fundamentalist Christians and fundamentalist Muslims. And, there's this tendency, especially in integral circles, not to want to criticize particular religious traditions. But a religious tradition has the full spectrum there too. So religious traditions also have pathologies, and this is what allows, for example, the horrible tragedy of Catholic priests and the abuse of children. And it's not that you want to throw away the church or Jesus Christ in particular, but you definitely want to throw away this transgressive, illegal behavior. And so we got to be able to make these type of very important distinctions. And then that also comes to the fact, since that was one of the things Ken and the spectrum tended to do, is you can see how you have childish behaviors, adolescent behaviors, and then mature behaviors. So part of what the modern world tends to do, and many psychologists have noticed this, we tend to be kind of adolescent in our development. And one of the tendencies of adolescence is to say, don't tell me what to do. I do what I want to do, And so the modern tendency of the scientific mind is like, I don't need any spiritual teacher. I know how to take care of my own business. I will abuse drugs and abuse alcohol, and I will do whatever I want to do. Just leave me alone, right? And yes, everybody has to have legal rights to do what they want, but a mature individual will realize that there is processes greater than themselves. And so we must learn how to humble ourselves and turn to authorities that have developed greater ethic and moral capacities, and also look to the great tradition and the great adepts like Jesus and Buddha, Padmasambhava, and the list is endless. Saint Teresa, Gandhi, Martin Luther King, even on those type of levels of people that become attractors to what we can further develop into. And so that's why you don't want to throw out the baby with the bathwater, as Ken would often say.
And as you've been emphasizing yourself in what you've been saying, Brad, and the importance of taking the best. And and those couple of things you said, I really want to just make sure we don't get lost, because you throw out these one-liner gems, and that is that, you know, there's a trap in the integral in a lot of communities of not criticizing. But for example, not criticizing religion, but there's there's as wide a span of perspectives and levels within religions as there are between them. So there's pathology and primitivism and fundamentalism within each tradition, just as there's extraordinary transcendence and wisdom, et cetera, et cetera. So, and we need to make a distinction, which isn't always made, between judgment as in the sense of condemnation and judgment in the sense of discernment. And one leads to anger, aggression, the other leads to wisdom. And we really need the discernment.
Well said, Roger. Absolutely.
And I want to just add in a couple of things to what you said about, because I'm really wanting to bring out these distinctions between the problematic and beneficial groups. And so you alluded to some of these. One is there are three that I remember. One is the distinction which you gave for teachers. Do the supposed benefits of the community come from either the leader, the so-called charismatic leader, and that person's gifts or manner or power, or are they technical? Do the gifts come from a technique, a practice? So that's one crucial distinction. Another are these communities pointing to a uni-level or a multi-level possibility? Is it like everything is to be attained in this world as we are now, etc., or is there the recognition of further potentials and possibilities and transcendent states? And finally, is the community exclusive, that is, we are the chosen ones, or are they inclusive, that is, everyone has the potential for reaching these goals? And those are the three dichotomies or spectrums that I remember as being really important in differentiating these communities. So there may be others, but anyway, I wanted to get that in. So
yes, I can tell you've been doing your research on spiritual choices, because those are the main developmental adjudication models that are brought forward in that book.
Well, I just reread your book, Brad. So yes, I have been doing my homework. I spent significant time with this one, Embracing Reality. It's such an exquisite volume. Let's see. So to recapitulate, we've gone through a lot. We've gone through Ken's phase 1 or spectrum. We've gone through his phase 2, which was his developmental breakthrough, and phase 3, where he parsed out the development of different psychological capacities. And we've been kind of we got into stage 4, which is where he expanded from not just psychological or internal, but to a recognition of and openness to exploration of all 4 major domains of reality, and the recognition they all evolve and develop in their own ways. and to integrating them. We've covered 4 of the major phases of Ken Wilber's work, but there was still one further phase, sometimes called the phase 5. And Brad, could you tell us how Ken's thought and work and writings and contributions changed then?
Well, the so-called phase 5 is when the new millennium dawned, and Ken opened up the Integral Institute. And basically, he went from being 30 years of a solitary writer, not attending public seminars and such, which annoyed a lot of people in the transpersonal psychology movement. He totally did an entire about-face. He got some funding from patrons and created the Integral Institute and opened his doors and asked all the people that were reading his books, which at that time were a younger generation, and they all came to Denver, Colorado. He had been living in Boulder through most of the 1990s, and he started giving public seminars and speaking to the public and trying to make integral and aqual a worldwide movement. And that's kind of when I started to back away, because I wasn't going to move to Denver. And, I sent emissaries like Terry Patton and friends that I knew. And he developed, the Integral Life Practices. That was a book that him and Terry Patton and some other folks developed, and started to, try and enter the university systems. And places like the United Nations started to use the Aqua model. He was interested. Some people like Jamie Wheel went out into the corporate world and tried to take the Aqua model into the corporate, because people like, the guy that runs Whole Foods, John Mackey, I believe is his name, all had been reading Wilber. In fact, people like Bill Clinton and Al Gore had also read Ken Wilber and mentioned his names there in the late 1990s. So Ken was trying to, establish the Integral Institute as a public arms to helping to transform the world. And it was initially successful, but they found out, as Jamie Wheel kind of so expertly explains in some of his YouTube talks, the business world just wasn't quite ready to take on all that interior development, because they still have quarterly reports due. And money is mostly an exterior realm. It's the lower right quadrant, so he was only able to get so far with that type of thing, and but his reach really was extensive, and a lot of young people who now run the Integral Life website, which I highly recommend to everybody, run by Corey DeVos. And, such people as Jeff Salzman with his Integral Politics, which he does an excellent analysis of contemporary events based upon the developmental scheme that Ken had laid out. So there's a lot of different enterprises. And a lot of times now when people speak of Integral, they're actually pointing to phase 5. And this is also when Ken began his integral post-metaphysical critique, and he kind of started deconstructing the perennial philosophy with more intensity. And these were the kind of things that I didn't fully agree with Ken. And as I said, I was working with him almost daily through the 90s. And his attention got drawn to other areas. So I started to back away from that and just, look on from a further outside vantage point. But I always kept a great pulse on it. And so I think part of my work is to always keep reminding people of the great depth of those first 30 years of Ken's work, because that was the foundation that inspired all of us, John and Roger, and a lot of other people, as we move forward into the future. Because also what happened in 2006, Ken's health issues really started to multiply. He had contacted a disease, possibly from a toxic spill in Tahoe in the late 80s, that was debilitating. And so his public work had to also step back to deal with his health issues. And this is part of the reason in the last 20 years he has not written as many books. And to some degree, he was, standing on the great work that he had done initially. So the phase 5 is kind of integral application, in which he tried to apply, and he had other people apply the AQUIL developmental scheme to the various fields of science, technology, education, politics, business, and that type of things. So once again, it's an incredible web that he has created and that other people are carrying forward into the future.
And there have been, as you say, there was a library he created before this, but there were still some significant books, and you speak very highly, for example, of integral psychology. Could you give us the distillation of that?
Well, Integral Psychology was the book that came out in the year 2000, and it was kind of really a recapitulation of all his previous phases up to that point. And personally, it's my favorite book because it is such a great summary, and yet it's, only 200 and some pages. In fact, I had the great pleasure of watching him write that because Ken, his genius is so incredible that he can write nearly flawlessly a chapter that basically gets published the way he first writes it. And if you guys, I know Roger's a writer. Do you write, John? I mean, the impossibility of being able to use your first draft as the published format alone sets Ken Wilber apart from everybody else. So when he was writing Integral Psychology, he would send me a new chapter every day. And I just would go, my gosh, I might make a couple comments and he might add a few things here and there, but I mean, a new chapter every day.
And nauseating.
I know. It's like, do you really have to cram this into my face and show me how far behind I am? But it was brilliant, integral psychology. Yeah,
book.
there you go. Exactly. It's so clean. And I mean, a chapter a day. So it doesn't get bogged down in details. And the other great thing about integral psychology is the collection of charts in the back of the book, which reviews over 100 different developmental theorists. And so if you want to get a picture of how Ken was able to integrate hundreds of thinkers, both traditional religious traditions and psychology systems, and Gebser and Aurobindo, look at the back chapters of Integral Psychology, and you will get a summary of Ken's work, which, by the way, I think I included in the rear of Embracing Reality as well. And so that was kind of where Ken, summarized everything up, and it gave him then the freedom to do things like the Boomeritis novel. He always warned us that he could write the worst novel ever. And of course he was joking, but I think he actually fulfilled that. And wrote Boomeritis, and that attracted a lot of the young people because he was critiquing the boomer generation. So the millennials really got off on that.
Well, Brad, tell us a little bit about the precise nature of the critique, because It was a very curious novel. It was deliberately ironic, deliberately postmodern. I mean, all the features you associate with postmodernism, including some of the worst, he deliberately incorporated. So there's the medium and the message, but there was some very interesting messages in that curious medium. So maybe you could tell us a little bit about
Well,
messages.
yeah, and I will say is my least favorite Wilbur book. So I, wasn't, that blown away by it, though I laughed at a lot of the things he was saying because boy, the gall and courage for him to come out. So what he was basically doing was critiquing the so-called boomer generation, which would have been mine and Ken's generation, is that we tended to be narcissistic, even in our use of spirituality. The old Dharma bum critique, whereas you basically use spiritual concepts that, hey, everything's God, so that means you can do whatever you want. And so that he was really critiquing what he calls the green postmodernist and their tendency to use spiritual ideas and concepts to really inflate their ego, not transcend their ego. And so he tended to, make fun of that, and he did it in terms of he had characters in there, and of course he was the voice of all the different characters. And I think Ken's voice was actually one of the professors.
He was one of the students, actually, I think, in this one.
His name was,
Oh,
but
okay.
his
I see
actual
what you mean. Yeah.
voice of what he wanted to get the message across came through the lady professor and all that. But he took on everything from tantra sex to, everything else under the sun, which allowed his humor to come out. Because, Roger, Ken is really a very funny guy when you hang out with him, and his humor is dry and yet pointed, and yet of course that doesn't tend to come through in his books because those are intellectual exercises and whatnot, but in Boomeritis he was on full display, which is why it was so offensive to a lot of people, maybe even me, and yet at the same time it allowed him a venue to be able to critique the self-centered spirituality and new age sentiments of the boomer generation. And like I say, I think the millennials, they understood the hypocrisies of their parents and everything. And so I think it was very attractive to the younger generation, let alone it had to be one of the worst covers with that big smiley face on it, I think, ever published.
And in addition to the critique of the supposed narcissism of the boomer generation, and unfortunately that it seems like the research indicates subsequent generations score even higher on narcissistic scale. So maybe we can blame social media for that. But there was also, it seemed to me, maybe the central critique was even more of postmodernism and the failings or inherent flaws of postmodernism, and the idiosyncrasies, contradictions when the ideas were taken to the logical extreme, etc. So personally, I found it quite educational in that, because I certainly haven't been a deep student of postmodernism. I know it's been a very important intellectual movement and seems somewhat paradoxical, but to have a book which really laid out and skewered some of these postmodern fallacies, for me, it was very helpful.
Well, you bring up a very important fact, Roger. One of the things that happened with Ken's works, especially in the 90s, as he was putting out a book every year, is a lot of time the new book was addressing what his critics had brought up about his previous books, right? And so in Sexology and Spirituality, where he outlines the entire evolutionary arc of the universe, and he comes up with this meta theory, and people are comparing him to Hegel and everything, the postmodernists really drove into him and said, hey, postmodernism has shown that meta theories are just, self-centered solipsism, and that, you're succumbing to what Hegel succumbed to. And we've gone beyond postmodern narratives, because basically what you're giving us is a white guy's version of European, philosophy and all that type of thing. In other words, they pointed out that Ken had not adequately addressed the postmodern critique of modernity and of overarching meta theories. And so, especially beginning with the marriage of science and spirituality, which came out, I think, in 1999, Ken started to address what the postmodern critique was about. And in Ken's way of claiming everybody is true but partial, he acknowledged that the postmodern critique had a lot of validity to that. And one of the main ideas of postmodernism is that every worldview, whatever worldview you have, is conditioned by your cultural conditioning and the culture and the time and space in which you grew up into. And that's how they are able to deconstruct any worldview that's ever put out there, especially a worldview that claims to be including all worldviews, right? Postmodernists say, no, that's just your particular point of view, and da 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 da. Whereas Ken was trying to, with his entire work, was trying to emphasize the universal character of human development. And it was a cross-cultural phenomena, which studies tend to verify. But so Ken had to use boomeritis and the marriage of sense and soul to address these postmodern critiques, which I feel he did very deftly. But in a certain sense, he did it tongue-in-cheek as well, because, as he pointed out, they do a performative contradiction. In other words, postmodernism says you can't have an overarching worldview, and yet my worldview saying you can't have an overarching worldview is itself an overarching worldview. So the postmodernists could contradict themselves in the process, which is why I feel that ultimately a spiritual worldview, a transpersonal worldview that includes all the different worldviews, including modernity, mythic thinking, and the postmodern critique, is actually the most fullest worldview that embraces all of reality, right?
Beautiful. And you mentioned the book which we hadn't mentioned before, which was The Marriage of Sense and Soul, which, as you said, partly addressed postmodernism, but also, of course, as with everything Ken does, covered a lot more. Could you give us a little summary or distillation of key points from that?
Well, that was the one book that he actually took outside of Shambhala. He went to New York and met with different publishers that wanted to publish him, and Random House ended up winning the bid. And the book was originally called Integrating Science and Religion. And of course, Random House goes, that's not going to work. So they used an Oscar Wilde quote that he had quoted on the front of his piece, talking about the integration of sense and soul. So sense being obviously science and soul being religion, right? And so he gave a very systematic outline of how, if you're going to be integral, how do you integrate a value-free science with a value-laden religion, right? And so he gave some ideas about how you can use the dignities or the positive good news of each of those major worldviews and combine the positive good news while throwing away the negative disasters or bad news, which in the case of religion would be mythic thinking and closed minds, right? That only my worldview is right, only my religion is right, and jettisoning those type of disastrous developments And in the case of science, jettisoning the scientific materialism worldview. And so that's what the marriage of sense and soul attempted to do. And that was the book that actually Al Gore and Bill Clinton read. For one, it was done by Random House, so it had much wider distribution. And it addressed the topics that most modern people, postmodern people, are very concerned with, is how do we mitigate this clash of civilizations? Because that's what we're in the middle of. We are in the middle of a battle of worldviews, a war of worldviews, where science and religion, which has had now a backlash against the dominance of science in the 20th century. Religious fundamentalists are saying, no, you guys don't have a value system. You basically say everything goes, whereas we actually have a way of making proper judgments. And as we all know, a lot of times religions are not capable of making humanitarian adjustments because they tend to be exclusive. And so Ken was saying we need to use the best of both of those worlds and integrate them in a way that is tolerant of all the different worldviews. And yet, by continuing the further development of your human capacities, develop a ethics and a morality that is able to make appropriate judgments about what is good for the human race and what is good for your own individual development.
And partially, I think it's applying the scientific method to interiors. Again, we go from the flatland, but when you start taking that scientific attitude to discover the truth, you run into interiors and you run into values and you run into all the things that the religion have been talking about to a large extent.
And that's what psychology does, right?
True.
Psychology uses the scientific method to develop the interiors, which is one of the great gifts of the 20th century. And that's an important work. And of course, as people realize that a lot of pathologies permeate our culture, it's access to proper psychological healing that becomes one of the great therapeutic methods for helping to heal a fractured culture and worldview, right?
And there have been so many attempts to, quote, marry sense and soul, i.e. Point to a possible reconciliation between the worldviews of science and religion. But Ken was able to do it at a level of sophistication far beyond what had come before, because he had his integral framework within which to draw appropriate distinctions between different levels, different epistemologies, different states of consciousness, etc., and point to the way in which these two great realms could be complementary in some ways, as long as we recognize the pathologies and limitations of each. So,
excellent point. But let me just add to that, Roger, because sometimes it sounds like Ken created this model just based upon intellectual considerations, that, oh, I figured this out and I figured that out. But as we know from knowing Ken personally, we know that his model also reflects his own spiritual development. And it's based upon the reality of transpersonal awareness. In other words, is based upon practice, which kind of circles us back to how we opened our conversation, the importance of getting personally involved in developing your own consciousness, because that's the only way you're really going to be able to integrate all of these various things. You can't just do it with the mind. It has to ultimately be done with the heart. And that takes real spiritual living. You really do have to learn how to meditate in order to open up the greater capacities that each of us have inside of us. And Ken was a pioneer in encouraging us to do that, but transpersonal psychology too. I mean, Esalen and the entire humanistic potential movement that was the better part of the boomer generation, not the narcissistic one, but the actual cutting edge, is part of what we have to continue to embed into our current social situation. That's why, having political leaders, for example, Marianne Williamson, who knows Ken Wilber, by the way, she's a presidential candidate, and she is speaking from integral consciousness, in which she is trying to be tolerant of all the different worldviews, but also give us a higher vision of how we can live together more peacefully and more truthfully as a collective reality. And so to a large degree, that's what we have to start to see. We need to see integral thinkers start to permeate our institutions to help become beacons and establish a more integral society for global reconciliation.
Interesting. You mentioned Marion Williamson because she is a very rare example of someone who is integrally informed and has a contemplative practice, and yet is very extremely well informed about political affairs and thinks very deeply about them, but from a profound value perspective of the reduction of human suffering and its fullness. And that's so rare. And yet, as you point out, we really are going to need, if not the philosopher kings of Plato and the sage king of Confucius, then at least we need a little wisdom and post-conventional maturation in our leaders. So yes,
yeah, that's right. Because otherwise, what will tend to happen is there will tend to be a regression. And I think, most of the people listening to this type of podcast will realize that what has happened in the last 4, 6, 8 years in the political atmosphere of the United States is there has been a regression backwards, because people do not understand the great potential that our future could hold for us. And so people tend to retreat to things that they are more safe with, which is why there's been a rise of nationalism, while racism has come to the foreground. And in a certain sense, it seems to be history is calling us to address these dark pathologies that had not been properly addressed, because it takes the collective as a whole. We can have great leaders like John Kennedy or Martin Luther King or Gandhi, but and the philosopher King, as you mentioned, can't do it by himself or herself. It takes all of us to do this together. In fact, I was just reading an article today saying in India, Gandhi is being dismissed more regularly now. In fact, I won't even go into the fact that there's a whole movement that honors the person that assassinated him. These are regressive movements, and this is the rise of autocracy that is being talked about. And why people are so afraid that we are possibly losing our democracy, because democracy is a modern developmental institution. And if we, the people, don't end up protecting the developmental progress that we have made in history, what we will tend to do is just regress back down the spectrum to lower levels of consciousness and thinking. And that ultimately will be very destructive if those kind of forces are allowed to arise. But you can see that's exactly what is happening.
That was so well said and so important to say right now. I really, really deeply appreciate that.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what we need to, as integral thinkers to, be very active politically in reaching out. And, that's one of the beauties about integral thinking. Integral thinking is really about, encouraging people to become their better selves, to become the better half, our better angels, as Lincoln said, and that's really what it's about. It's not about alienating or even overly critiquing anybody. It's about encouraging everybody to develop and to become the greater part of themselves. And that means being inclusive and also being able to make value judgments. That's one of the great things that Steve McIntosh and Jeff Salzman, who deal with developmental politics based upon Ken's theories, have given us, is a way to recognize that the so-called far right and the fundamentalists, they have some valid points. You don't want to lose tradition. You don't want to lose family structures. You got to be careful about, what you want to get rid of. But at the same time, they are offering us a limited worldview that excludes the truths of other people that don't think like them. And one of the things about a democracy is a democracy, by separating church and state, wants to be tolerant to all worldviews, that you use your own conscience, to choose what religion you want to believe, and that all religions or all points of view, including the atheist point of view, right, has a right to exist in a free society. And so integral, in a way, is a way of helping to secure the rights of liberty and justice that democracy has established in the last 200 years.
I echo what John said. Beautifully said, Brad. We've covered so much here, and we've covered almost the entire arc of Ken Wilber's combined works. There are just two books, his most recent books, we haven't mentioned, and I think for completion, so we can point to this dialogue as having covered the whole spectrum, to use a coin a phrase, of Ken's work. We should just briefly at least mention his two latest books, which were both of which came out in 2017. One was The Religion of Tomorrow, a massive 800-page tome, and the other was a briefer, about 100-page. What was it, Post-Truth World? So, Brad, would you say something about maybe, take your pick of which one you want to go first?
Yeah, well, The Religion of Tomorrow, which a lot of times Ken uses the acronym to his books, like Sex Ecology, Spirituality, calls SES, and Brief History is BH. And so we noticed that with The Religion of Tomorrow, you want to call it trot, not rot. Right? And The Religion of Tomorrow, because it's 800 pages, is actually it's a recapitulation of that developmental scheme that he started outlining way back in the Atman Project, right? So when you read The Religion of Tomorrow, you're getting the full developmental view that Ken has, articulated over the last 40 years of his career. And so it is actually quite a marvelous book. And the Post-Truth book that you were referring to was a response to Trump getting elected. In the fact that we are living in a post-truth world, when, in other words, we're living in a postmodern world where, since all truths have been deconstructed by postmodernism, or the relativity of all cultural perspectives, then almost any truth can be true, which attributes to the rise of conspiracy theories. So in other words, you get on the internet and get down in that rabbit hole where you're only getting facts that are going to support that particular point of view. Everything can end up being a conspiracy. And, fake news, right, that Trump made so popular. We have no way of having a value judgment because the news that we're getting is being fed to us by the corporate media structures of the world. And so Ken was saying that at least that's how I interpreted it, is that Ken was saying that in a post-truth world, it's going to make you rely on an integral approach to actually be able to discern what is true, what is good, and what is beautiful. And you have to develop your consciousness. You have to grow up. You have to wake up. You have to clean up, and then you have to show up in the world with a higher level of understanding and development. in order to counter these regressive tendencies that is happening in the world at large. And so, in other words, he gives us a little developmental map that helps get us out of this quagmire of not knowing how to make proper value judgments and ethical judgments. And so he has certain, things like, how does it go, Roger? I haven't reviewed it. The greatest depth the deepest depth for the greatest span. In other words, the more people that have more depth to their consciousness is what we want to really shoot for. So our educational systems and our therapeutic systems, as well as offering techniques for further transpersonal development, is the best way that we're going to be able to establish a equitable society in which justice and compassion become the guidelines for our future. And this will also mean that we have to take care of those fundamental levels, the most fundamental levels, as well as the higher transpersonal levels. In other words, the biosphere has to be protected in order for the noosphere and the theosphere to thrive and develop. So if we don't take care of our planet and the environment in which we're all living, the mind and the soul will not be able to continue its evolutionary journey. And so that is part of what Ken is addressing in this climate warming that we're going through. And so those are important themes. He also has another book out recently, but a lot of times these books are PDF treatments that you can find on Integral Life, called Integral Revolutionary Transformation, in which he talks about the necessity for the society to evolve. You have to have a certain security in your technological, economic, developmental base in order for higher superstructures or worldviews to emerge. So in other words, every generation has the same responsibilities to take care of each other and to offer the developmental conveyor belt, another Ken Wilber term, to allow the proper higher development of human consciousness. But if you don't handle those lower levels appropriately, you're going to have pathological higher developments, and the full spectrum of humanity will not be able to blossom.
Again, wow.
Yeah.
I feel like I just want to go, amen, brother, and start, pounding on the table. Beautifully, be passionately said.
Thank you. But it's because I'm standing on the platform of integral philosophy that allows, me to call out these various modes of understanding. And that's what we all have this capacity if we learn how to be integral. In fact, that's one of the things that I try to emphasize in my talks is about the importance of being integral, not just thinking integral, but being integral, which means you have to take up the integral life practices. You have to become a healthy ego, as well as learning how to appropriately transcend the ego in spiritual ecstasies. So, this is one of the great things that a podcast like you guys have. Deep transformation. That's what it's about. We have to transform ourselves, and the way we do that is by handling all the earlier stages as well as the higher stages, right? So thank you for the work that you guys are doing. I really
thank you, Brad. You've given us an encyclopedic overview of the work of one of the great geniuses of our time. And I think we would all agree that Ken Wilber really is one of the the great minds of our time, and has presented us with an intellectual synthesis that is unparalleled. and that provides a framework for the integration and implementation of the world's knowledge. It doesn't deal with all the details, but it does provide a framework by which we can see relationships and understand aspects of ourselves and human development and society and culture in ways we never could before, and that we can integrate, as you said, science and religion. We can see how these can fit together beneficially for the welfare and awakening of all. We see the potential of so many things that seemed conflictual, but we can now recognize are partial pointers to a larger whole. And that's a beautiful, beautiful gift he's given us. And Brad, you've given us a beautiful gift in providing an overview of this, because it's a major challenge to really go through Ken's works. And you, from your years of study and exploration and practice, have become an instrument who can literally transmit Ken's wisdom and vision. And thank you so much for doing that for us. And your books. Sorry, go ahead, John.
Oh, I'm just the way that you, especially right toward the end here, how you summarized basically everything we've been talking about. You brought it all together, and I found it extremely informative as well as very moving. So it's an honor to be here with you and Roger and listen to you to talk about Ken's work and your experience and the historical context that this arose in, and just an inspired performance. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Indeed.
Yes.
And
many thanks to Ken. He's still with us, and all our love goes to what Ken has given the world, and it's our responsibility to effectively spread the word, per se, right?
well, you've done a great job, and you've done a great job of that in your books. I want to recommend again the two overviews of Ken's work that you've given us: Embracing Reality, the Integral Vision of Ken Wilber, and Where's Wilber At? Subtitle, Ken Wilber's Integral Vision in the New Millennium. And of course, you have other books, particularly.
And let me mention those two books are available in Kindle format on Amazon.com.
All right. And you also have your other major magnum opus, God's Great Tradition of Global Wisdom, with various excerpts and books that have been based on that. So thank you so much. So Brad, on behalf of everyone listening, thank you so much. You've really given us all a incredible gift.
It's been a lot of fun. Hope we get to do it again. And thank you for the excellent questions. I really appreciate it, John and Roger. It's been a pleasure being with you.